Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Backer and welcome to Off the Wall Novels. Pringle's cage is open. We'll see if he can grace us with his presence, if he feels like it. But today I'm going to talk about alchemy, and this is a topic that I'm kind of new to, even though I'm aware that people like Carl Jung were into it. But it's only been since I got into Goethe and Faust that I've started to take alchemy a little bit more seriously as an aesthetic and as like a philosophy. And so once again, I'm definitely new to this. I'm not coming at this as an expert, but I am coming at this more of just a lover of art and a lover of imagery, and specifically occult imagery that can be put into a work of fiction. And so if you guys watch this channel, you know that I love when an author like Thomas Pynchon can take philosophy and then put that into the imagery of his scenes. And so I have kind of followed that as a breadcrumb trail to other aesthetics, because you also might know that some of the videos that I posted, maybe a year ago, was expressing this kind of, tiredness with postmodernism and wanting to get into something new, but not really knowing what I should get into. So I can say definitively that I have found it. It's occultism and alchemy, and it's literally going to be the project of my 30s. It's going to take so long, and it is kind of intimidating because a lot of this imagery is a little opaque. A lot of the imagery can be contradictory depending on who's writing about it and what philosopher or what historian and what angle they bring to it. But something that I was finding as I was reading Faust in particular was that a lot of the critical essays in my edition were a little resistant to treating alchemy with seriousness. And a lot of the scenes that I thought were extremely potent for spiritual and occult and alchemical interpretation, they would say like, oh, this actually doesn't really have a lot of relevance to contemporary readers. He's just doing a satire of like German politics at the time. And I think, if I may say so myself, that this is just kind of a resistance within the 20th century in general to take seriously some of these ideas that I am starting to take seriously in a way that I was kind of resistant to. And I also think that just in my own fiction, I've always wanted to engage spiritual topics, but I have found a little resistance in myself of doubling down on it and going as hard into it as I can. And even though I'm really proud of my novel, Lionel, Lancet, and the Right Vibe, a big aspect of that book was kind of holding the spiritual element with a loose grasp, seeing it as something that's beautiful and inspiring while also realizing it's kind of silly and like not really worth taking seriously. And for this next novel I'm working on, The Kingdom of Liminal Space, I want to challenge myself to stare into the face of it a little bit more directly and just kind of own the fact that I am inspired by this imagery and by different experiences I've had in that regard, and I'm only couching my message by poking fun at it or by like undercutting it with irony. So like I said, Carl Jung is somebody that probably introduced me to the idea of alchemy, but what's funny is that now that I'm reading some outside sources on alchemy, more from when it was taken seriously, because Jung was a 20th century writer, I believe for all of his career, that it's kind of made me realize that even Carl Jung is a little too dry. It's a little stiff. And as I've learned more about Jung, it's clear to me that he wanted his philosophy to be a science. And I think that that might have been his biggest downfall, that if he had just owned the mystical element a little bit more without having to try to put it into a rigorous system, not that it'd be better received, because people love Carl Jung. I still love Carl Jung, but I think it'd just be more fun to read, of not having to like kind of, bring this like psychological veneer to everything, or the scientific veneer, and just let it be mystical and let it be spiritual. And again, like, who am I to criticize Carl Jung? But the main reason I levy that criticism is to say that like a lot of the books that confront it more directly are more fun and just easier to read, whereas Carl Jung is tough. Okay, so I'll get off my Carl Jung tangent for a second, but all of this kind of started when I heard a guy named Mitch Horowitz on the Duncan Trussell Family Hour, and he was promoting his book Modern Occultism, and I knew that some of the stuff I was into was related to the occult, but I wasn't really sure how. And I recommend this book to everybody because it is very accessible. It's like I don't mean this in any derisive way, it's like a pop history book for the occult. And I really love pop intellectual history in particular because this book synthesizes ideas from so many books that I could not read in an entire lifetime. But then also, it has me going to my Amazon cart, filling it with new books and new pathways of investigation for not only research on the next novel, but just for my own interest as a reader. So that's where I started, and I bought this about a year ago at the same time that I got into Faust, because he was talking about Faust quite a bit on that Duncan Trussell Family Hour podcast while he was promoting the book. And there's a short section in here about Goethe and Faust and like the alchemical and occult underpinnings. And so just the way he was talking about it really inspired me and made me want to kind of branch out of the usual things that I read, which are mostly from the 20th century. And I actually had kind of like an explicit aversion to older stuff. And I was so wrong, and I'm so glad to be wrong, because I just feel so overwhelmed for the first time, probably since college, with how many books I'm excited to read, and with how many new ideas that are in this occult and alchemical umbrella, and that it is taken seriously in different centuries, more so than it would be today, because we do live in like an age of materialism and scientific rationalism. And even with Pynchon, somebody who is obviously one of my favorite writers, and he used a lot of occult imagery, specifically in Gravity's Rainbow, I found that a lot of his postmodern treatment of those themes might, it's not very committal. I love Pynchon, but like, you don't always get the sense that he's advocating for one belief system over another, and that's kind of the traditional postmodern lens. So again, I'm just like overjoyed to just be this inspired after going through a period of a couple of years of just not really knowing what my next step was going to be as a reader and as a writer. And of course, now that I've found it, it feels like, duh, of course I would be into this. But without further ado, I just want to do a reading or two from some of these alchemical books that I've come across here, and do my best to get some like initial interpretation going. I'm probably going to do another essay on Goethe's Faust Part 2, because I only did that first one related to Part 1, and I was kind of digesting Part 1 for most of my first year as a teacher. And as I've said in other videos, reading Faust as a first-year teacher felt like a synchronicity, that I should just so happen to get into this, because the premise is about this guy who is extremely learned, and he has apparently exhausted all of the possible things that can be known with the traditional light of knowledge. And so naturally, he opens up a book of magic and turns to the dark side to see what's lurking in the shadows. And that alone is just such a blast. And even without knowing a lot of the historical background on alchemy and occultism, that's the imagery that really inspired me when I started reading Faust, in addition to just the beautiful poetry throughout the entire thing. And so it, again, made me feel kind of silly for being resistant to reading older stuff, because a lot of what I was getting sick of in postmodernism wasn't necessarily the style. It was much more of this kind of contemporary nihilism, or this contemporary irony that David Foster Wallace talks about, or just, the need to kind of like push off anything that's assertive and confident and willful in belief for something that's more mitigated or more deconstructed. And so, you just go back one century or so and you're like, oh yeah, these people believe in God. These people are spiritual people. And so just the directness and confidence with which they're writing about it is so refreshing. And so if any of that sounds fun to you guys, I'd recommend getting into Faust. Or, I had a good friend, Henry Jelinas, just recently recommend me Duino Elegies by Rilke, which also had a big influence on Pynchon and Gravity's Rainbow in particular. And Duino Elegies, I haven't read it yet. I'll definitely make a video about it when I do. I guess he had this spiritual experience on the top of a mountain where he felt like he was being spoken to directly by the gods, or a god. I don't know a lot about it yet, but it's right in the camp of my recent interest, and it's definitely going to be influencing The Kingdom of Liminal Space, my next novel, if it's coming out on Christmas. But I'm going to give a little bit more background on Part 2 of Faust before I read this short passage here, and I'll put a little, I'll put it on the screen too so you guys can read along. But essentially, occultism and hermeticism in particular is kind of based in this idea, as above, so below. You might not have known it was related to those things. I definitely didn't, but I'd heard that many times, as above, so below. And in particular, it's related to this kind of synchronicity between the macrocosm and the microcosm. We have all of our particulars in our human world on Earth, but then there are spiritual elements or these guiding forces or maybe even platonic forms. There's a lot of different fill in the blanks that you could put in for the macrocosm. And part 1 of Faust takes place in the microcosm, and part 2 takes place in the macrocosm. And right away in part 2, it is reminding me so much of Pynchon, of this like layered imagery, and it's just so evocative, and there are these references to old Greek mythology and Roman mythology and different ways of representing the characters through the use of like a stage, because this is technically considered a drama or like a work of drama. And so within the play, the characters come on stage for this big parade, and it's like a carnival, and they have these costumes on that are evoking these different, mythical figures and these ideas and these things that would exist in the macrocosm that are guiding or synchronous with the microcosm. And it reminded me a lot of a postmodern move or something that Pynchon might do, because it's not just the reference to the person that their costume is of, it's also reminding us that it's a representation. And so when we see these people parading across in Carnival, I think it's called Carnival, right? The festival before Mardi Gras. When we see them parading across the stage in these costumes, we get this sense of not only the thing that they're representing, but that they are representing it, that it is given to us as a representation and a construction. And so that should be pretty familiar to fans of Pynchon, or that scene in Broom of the System with like the family systems therapy when they're putting on the masks. I think that's family systems therapy. I know I'm kind of combining a lot of ideas here, but after establishing that part 2 is in the macrocosm and that there are all these different representations of these Platonic ideals and these different important figures from mythology, we get this emperor. And the emperor appears to be kind of an analog for Faust himself. He's like the guiding power within his mind, or the guiding power in the macrocosm for him. And he's calling on Mephistopheles to help him find like money. And this is where I was disappointed with the critical interpretation in the book, because they were saying that this was a comment on like the way that paper money was becoming more popular in Germany at the time. And I think that's true, but I think that's only one interpretation of this, because after I've read a little bit more of Goethe's particular interest in alchemy and the occult, it's pretty clear that by gold and money, he's not necessarily looking for cash. He's looking for this like transcendent quintessence, or this like essential point to which everything strives. And I get that can be kind of vague, but gold is very symbolical here, that it's really supposed to represent something beyond our earthly means, or that essential something that everybody is looking for. And I'm sure that people who are more into the occult and alchemy would have a lot more detailed of an analysis than that, but it should also be intuitive to a lot of people that gold is traditionally used in fairy tales and mythology and storytelling to represent these, this prize, this thing that everybody is after. And in general, Faust's initial bargain with Mephistopheles, or the devil, is about if Mephistopheles can provide Faust with an experience that's so satisfying that he would never want to move on to the next thing. He would lose that mentality of the grass is always greener on the other side, and he would finally be satisfied, and it is only then that the devil is allowed to take Faust's soul. And so it's a more sophisticated interpretation of the Faust legend, because it's not a moral tale about don't sell your soul to the devil. It is Faust right to be cynical about how all satisfaction is fleeting? Or is Mephistopheles' cynicism correct, that all humans will eventually succumb to satisfaction and things like that? And so I might be wrong, but I think in this case, when the emperor in the macrocosm in Faust's mind, or in the macrocosm in general, is looking for gold from Mephistopheles, it's sort of a stand-in or a symbol for that transcendent ideal, or that amazing experience that's so satisfying it's the quintessence of your entire life. And quintessence is not a word I would usually use, but that's actually an alchemical word as well, that it would be like the final stage of reaching the philosopher's stone, or in transmuting lead into gold, or a baser metal into a higher metal. the quintessence would be the end of that process. And if I understand correctly, people like Carl Jung and other spiritual writers see within that also like human development, that when you are evolving and becoming a better version of yourself, you're kind of reaching toward this ideal, this quintessence, this like sort of purpose of your life that you were supposed to arrive at, this sense of like wholeness. There's a lot of different ways to talk about it, so I hope I'm not being too vague here. But all of this is context for the reading that I'm about to give, because the Emperor is essentially asking the devil for a way to get this gold. And Mephistopheles recommends to him, well, let's just look beneath our feet, because that's where metal is, right? It's in the ground. And that has some like kind of mixed reactions to the people in the crowd. And so I'm going to just read a brief stanza of the Emperor for context, and then this really cool stanza from Mephistopheles where he's talking about how he's going to turn all of these individual like representations in Faust's mind or in the macrocosm into these alchemists that are searching within the ground for gold. It's so beautiful. So this is the Emperor. To work, I fear you are adepter at pledge than proof. Go test your lather. Of lies at once let us foregather. In those fine halls, down sword and scepter, with these imperial hands I shall. If you speak truth, dig deep and well, or if you lie, send you to hell. And then Mephistopheles responds, I'd find the way myself, come worst to worst. Let me impress upon you first what unclaimed riches many a place would yield. A peasant ploughing in the field will lift a treasure from the furrow's fold, or as he scrapes a niter-crusted wall, recoil, rejoice to see a roll of gold, pure gold, into his frugal fingers fall. What vaulting must await exploding? What shafts and passageways well worth unloading, be thrust at by the treasure boating, new neighbors of the underground, and long-sealed cellars to the seekers, plump golden salvers, bowls, and beakers, in rich refulgent rows abound. Here goblets glow with ruby glare, and to employ them, then and there, an ancient vintage waits the taste, but as by experts truly told, its staves long sunk away in mold, and keg of tartar now encased, such rare intoxicating essence, as well as jeweled incandescence, in dread nocturnal darkness hide, the sage will search it readily enough. To see in light of day is trivial stuff. It is in gloom that mysteries abide. Wow. So on its surface, just beautiful writing. Amazing, and such an incredible translation too from Walter Arndt, because I've read other passages of different translations that felt very dry. So I recommend this one because in English, in translation, it's just absolutely beautiful. But some of these things really stick out to me. Obviously, this idea of plowing in a field and finding treasure within the folds of the plowing. So you're like literally becoming a miner in order to reach this transcendent ideal, or as if like the like macrocosm is sending these like roots down. That's something that is an image that I could dedicate a whole video to, but the impression that I get is when they're in the macrocosm, the way that it controls the microcosm or is synchronous with the microcosm is through like growing these roots, or by having like the ground of the macrocosm would technically be the sky here. And two, within Goethe the Alchemist, there's a lot of alchemical symbolism in the way that Goethe tried to understand botany and tried to understand plant growth, that it's reaching up toward this higher version of itself, and through these different expansions and contractions is essentially trying to go through this sevenfold stage of quintessence, or of reaching that higher ideal. And I mean, it's just beautiful. I hope I'm not being too rambly, because there are so many different images that you can connect to this stuff. But then two, it's talking here that like after mining into the ground, all of these like passageways occur. And so like it appears that it would be dead within the dirt, but he says, what vaulting must await exploding, what shafts and passageways well worth unloading, be thrust at by the treasure boating, new neighbors of the underground. So there's just this entire world that exists outside of the light of knowledge within the dirt. And those metals that you can find down there, that's that gold that you're really looking for. And my favorite line in this entire passage is, in long-sealed cellars to the seekers, plump golden salvers, bowls, and beakers, and rich refulgent rows abound. So they're all bringing out their alchemical machinery or alchemical apparatus in order to mine this gold in the macrocosm so that Faust might be satisfied down in the microcosm. And he briefly compares it to wine. And then obviously that last line has a lot of significance as well, and I'll give a little context for it, but such rare intoxicating essence as well as jeweled incandescence in dread nocturnal darkness hide, the sage will search it readily enough to see in light of day is trivial stuff. It is in gloom that mysteries abide. So back to that idea that light has always been a traditional sign of knowledge. Things that can be seen are said to be illuminated for you. But then the occult would be that which is hidden, that which is esoteric, that which is not necessarily presented for the world to be easily understood. And he also uses that word seeker, which is a word that is coming up a lot in these different books, that occultism is not something you're usually born into. You're not born into like an occult family. Now, I've lived in LA. I know that people are born into occult families. But in general, you are considered a seeker if it's something that you seek out, that you have to go and actually desire to find this knowledge. It's not something that'll necessarily just be passed down to you. And so I don't know if that in particular is what Goethe was referring to when he says a seeker here. He could just literally be talking about somebody who is seeking in the ground for gold, like a miner would. But I do find the coincidence to be pretty uncanny, even if it was unintentional. So that's that first little reading there. I was very impressed with it, and just across, especially part 2 of Faust, I'm running into a lot of really beautiful passages, and my bookmark fell out. This is another brief one. This one is not as apparently alchemical, but I'll give you guys some background details that will make it much clearer. That this is from one of the first scenes in part 2, or actually literally act 1, scene 1 of part 2, where Faust is kind of waking up and he's kind of throwing off this sense of sleep for himself, and the Greek chorus says, "Send your gaze to yonder brightness, wish on wish at will to reap. You are cradled but in lightness, cast it off, the shell of sleep. Scruple not to be audacious as the doubting rabble gasp. All is open to the gracious, who perceive and swiftly grasp." And so I really like that because it is a very inspiring message in addition to just being beautiful poetry. But that's something that I'm coming across in a lot of these spiritual texts and in the writers that are taking these ideas more seriously, is that it's much less about belief in spiritual forces, even though, I mean, there's plenty of that, don't get me wrong. But it's much more about like your will and your intention and like ways of putting yourself into frames of mind so that you can fluidly use your rationality at the service of your desire for what you want to happen, which is really cool and much more down to earth than I think people would expect. But then in Faust's enormous monologue here, he has this section that closes out the first scene in Act 1 that is just so gorgeous. And I interpret it as him kind of trying to figure out how all of the phenomenal world is just this fallen emanation from source consciousness, or from the like transcendent ideal, or from like God in wanting to create otherness so that it can know itself better, is in a way like a waterfall. And so I just wanted to give that as background info, and I'll do more interpretation after I read it. "So sun and back, my eye too weak to scan it, I rather follow with entrancement growing, the cataract that cleaves the jagged granite, from fall to fall and thousand leaps outthrowing, a score of thousand streams in its revolving, from upflung foam a soaring lacework blowing, but in what splendor from this storm evolving, vaults up the shimmering arc in variance lasting, now purely limbed and now in air dissolving, a cooling fragrance all about it casting. This mirrors all aspiring human action. On this your mind for clearer insight fasten, that life is ours by colorful refraction." Gorgeous. So I want to point out just a couple different things in there that might not immediately jump out to you as being occult or alchemical in nature. But again, after reading this book, it's undeniable that that's exactly what he was going for in part two and in part one, but also just in this specific passage. And so when he's looking at the sun and his eye is too weak to scan it, it's kind of like the power of the Godhead, or the power of that transcendent source consciousness is so powerful he can't look at it directly. He can only look at it glancingly through what emanates from it. And he says he would rather follow with entrancement growing the cataract that cleaves the jagged granite. So this emanation of the phenomenal world is the only thing he can focus on, because source consciousness is fundamentally removed from us. And it's cleaving the jagged granite, and it's particular that it's granite that it's cleaving here, because he believed, and just to be clear before I say this, this is not correct from a scientific standpoint, but he believed that granite was like the essential rock, that all other rocks would be like emanations, so to speak, or these like derivations. Oh, my computer almost turned off. But like all other rocks would be kind of like a derivation from granite, or it's like the essential Platonic rock in a certain way. I am positive I'm getting some of those details incorrect, just to put a fine point on it, but that is the essential alchemical thing that he was bringing into his scientific work. And a lot of it has not proven to be true, but approaching it from a more symbolical, aesthetic perspective, it's beautiful. And it, there's a reason people still read it, even though it's not scientifically accurate, because it is representing these kind of spiritual ideals. And likewise, what I said with the plant, that since a plant is growing up toward this essential purpose for itself and this quintessence for itself, which is actually just a word he, I believe, applied to the Philosopher's Stone, but I hope I can use it loosely here. I'm being kind of careful because I am new to this stuff, and I'm sure I'm making some mistakes along the way. But essentially the idea of having a primal something and all lesser things are derived from it is kind of coming from that like Gnostic or occult understanding of source consciousness and the way that reality occurred after the fact. All of that is to say, that's why he chose granite in this particular point, that he thought granite was this like essential rock, in the same way that all plants would be derivations of what he referred to as like the Urpflanz, Urpflanz, I think, and that's like the Platonic plant, the essential plant from which all other plants are derived. And so likewise, when at the end of that passage he says, "On this your mind for clearer insight fasten, that life is ours by colorful refraction." That's another example of that similar imagery, that he believed that all color was actually a lesser derivation of like the perfect light. And so when you shine a light through a prism, by the light having to hit a sense of opacity, even though a prism is transparent, he considered it opaque because it created colors out of it. And so that's how he's bringing together these various scientific fields for himself and these occult and alchemical images in this passage that is just so gorgeous, that all of humanity and all of reality is just this like waterfall that's coming from source consciousness that we can't ever really access, but we can only see the like mist and the waterfall that's coming down from it, and that's what gives us form and reality. And in that same way, life is ours by colorful refraction. And so everything within the phenomenal world only exists because of that essential or eternal light is shining down, and we're getting its refracted colors. Like just gorgeous stuff. So beautiful. I mean, I'm going to be interpreting this passage in particular probably for the rest of my life. I'm very taken with it. But I'm going to put Faust aside for a second and then just pull up one more book that I am not even close to beginning yet, called On the Marble Cliffs by Ernst Junger. So another German, but he was, I believe, writing this leading up to World War II. And on a side note, this book has one of the best introductions that I have ever read by Jesse Jezuska Stevens. I'm hope I'm not saying her middle name incorrectly, but I've never read an introduction to a book before where I've been like, oh my god, what an amazing piece of writing. Because he was a complex figure. He was anti-democracy, but anti-Nazi as well. So, I was a little nervous in buying his book. I'm like, I don't know who this guy's going to be. But he was using a lot of alchemical imagery in this book in particular. And some of it just like really, really stuck out to me right away. And it's been kind of synchronous for me because the different symbols from alchemy that I've read in this book have been giving me a deeper reading of this book, even though I've only read like 4 or 5 pages. Last preemptory thing I'm going to say before reading the passage is that I've only read 5 or 6 pages of it, but already it's reminding me of Nightwood and how beautiful it is and poetic it is. But it's different from Nightwood in that it's very easy to understand. So it's not stylistically like Nightwood, but it's hitting that same pitch of poetic brilliance that Nightwood hit for me. And I kind of compare everything to Nightwood after loving and adoring the prose in that book. And so from the get-go in the book, he's kind of looking back on what Germany used to be before the rise of fascism. And I'll just leave it at that. Bound to these walks are memories of a radiant, astonished waking that filled us with both awe and exhilaration. We felt as if we had emerged to the surface of life from its depths. Like a knock that rouses us from sleep, an image would pierce the darkness of our rapture. Perhaps the horn of a goat, such as peasants in these parts mount on tall poles in their gardens. Perhaps an eagle owl with yellow eyes perched on the roof ridge of a barn, or a meteor speeding and crackling across the firmament. Each and every time we would stop short as if petrified, a sudden shudder running down our spines. Then it seemed we had been granted a new faculty with which to see this land. We looked through eyes endowed with the power to see gold and crystals and gleaming veins far beneath the glassy earth. Oh my God! I'm going to read that last sentence again. Then it seemed we had been granted with a new faculty with which to see this land. We looked through eyes endowed with the power to see gold and crystals and gleaming veins far beneath the glassy earth. So I hope that the connection to that section that Mephistopheles said in Faust is clear, but he was saying that Germany before fascism rose was this beautiful place that he's looking back on about how he didn't appreciate it when it was there, but on these nights, piercing them from their rapture would be just something in the natural world, like the horn of a goat or an eagle owl, and that would break them out of the rapture for a moment. But then it was such a beautiful time that their eyes were endowed with the power to see gold and crystals and gleaming veins far beneath the glassy earth. And there are already a ton of other symbols related to alchemy and the occult here and on the Marble Cliffs, and so I am undoubtedly going to make a video about it when I'm finished, because I'm very taken with this book. It's very gorgeous in every single paragraph and giving me a ton of ideas for my next novel. But you guys, excuse me, I'm going to sign off for now so that this video doesn't get too long. Again, I'm sure I made some mistakes in this video because I'm very new to this study, so please don't hold it against me, and I hope I've inspired you to maybe crack open a book of the occult. Again, this was my introduction to all of this stuff, and I recommend this or a similar book. It's by Mitch Horowitz, and I've been getting into more of his stuff recently too. He makes it very accessible to what is kind of an intimidating and enormous field of study. So I'm sure that if you read this book or just some other stuff, it'd be a great access to the occult and mysticism and alchemy for you. And then also, I have really gotten a lot out of approaching this through Faust in particular, that I think if I just had to study the occult, that would be way too overwhelming because there is so much. So reading it with the intent to analyze Faust on a deeper level has been a great access point for me. And so even if you're not into Faust or anything similar, you might be able to find a book that's using alchemical imagery, and I would encourage you to do a deep dive, because chances are, if the author was into the occult and alchemy, then they worked pretty hard to research it and embed it at every layer of the story. So, signing off, my name is Daniel Backer. Check out my novel, Lionel, Lancet, and the Right Vibe if you have any interest. It's available on most online bookstores. And then also, I have The Kingdom of Liminal Space, my next album and novel, coming out on Christmas. So there is a concept album with it too. But that's all I've got for you today. Be well. See ya.